They chose the forest because no one would hear her scream. Under falling snow, 3 corrupt cops dug a grave deep enough to erase a life and their crime with it. What they didn't know was that a 45-year-old Navy SEAL, wrapped in a worn brown leather jacket, was watching from the trees, and beside him stood his German Shepherd, silent, tense, ready. One step forward would turn him into a hunted man. One step back would leave a woman buried alive before dawn. As the shovel hit frozen ground, he made his choice, and in that moment, an entire town's darkest secret began to unravel. If you believe compassion can rewrite destiny, like the video, subscribe for more stories, and comment where you're watching. See where this story will go. Snow fell hard over the Montana backcountry, thick and relentless, driven sideways by a wind that threaded through the ancient pines like whispered memories that refused to stay buried. Daniel Brooks moved slowly between the trees, every step deliberate boots, crunching deep into powder that swallowed sound and distance alike, the forest closing around him as if it had been waiting for his return. At 45, Daniel carried himself with the heavy economy of a man who had learned long ago that wasted movement could get you killed. His dark brown leather jacket, thick and scarred with age, creaked softly as he shifted his shoulders. Beneath it, a red and navy flannel clung to his frame, damp with cold. A gray wool scarf was wrapped twice around his neck, the ends tucked in tight, and his faded jeans showed pale creases from years of wear. The cold bit through it all anyway. It always did. Beside him padded Cooper, a full-grown German Shepherd, with a dense black and tan coat dusted white by snow, broad-chested and powerful even at rest. At 7 years old, Cooper was no longer young, but his amber eyes were sharp, tracking the forest with disciplined calm. He moved without a leash, close enough that Daniel could feel his presence, without looking the way soldiers learned to sense each other in the dark. Cooper had once been a working dog trained for search detection and controlled aggression. Retirement had softened his edges, but not his instincts. He was steady, watchful, and profoundly loyal, the kind of companion that did not ask questions when the world turned dangerous. Daniel had not come here to hunt. He had not come to test himself. He had come for the silence. Since leaving the Navy, silence was the only thing that dulled the constant echo of commands, explosions, and faces that never quite faded. The forest usually gave him that cold, empty honest. Tonight, it did not. Cooper stopped. The dog's body stiffened, tail low, ears snapping forward with sudden precision. A low rumble rose from his chest, not a bark, not a growl meant to warn, but something deeper, older, the sound of recognition. Daniel halted instantly, hand sliding into the pocket of his jacket, fingers curling tight against the worn leather lining as his eyes swept the darkness ahead. Cooper's back arched slightly, muscles coiling his breath slow and controlled. "What is it, boy?" Daniel murmured, his voice barely audible beneath the wind, not needing an answer so much as acknowledging the shift. The smell hit him first as he moved forward. Exhaust oil disturbed earth. Wrong smells, mechanical smells, things that did not belong this far from the road. Then the light cut through the trees. Headlights, harsh and white, spilling across a small clearing like an interrogation lamp. Daniel dropped instinctively behind the trunk of a thick pine, pulling Cooper in close with a subtle motion of his knee. From the edge of the clearing he saw them 3 adult men in sheriff's department uniforms, their tan jackets darkened by snow and sweat, their breath steaming as they worked. 2 of them shoveled with quick, nervous motions, throwing heavy clumps of frozen dirt aside. The third stood back, arms crossed, posture loose, in a way that suggested authority without effort. The hole they were digging was already deep, the edges rough, the ground torn open like a wound. Then Daniel saw her. She lay on the ground several feet from the pit, hands bound behind her back with zip ties that bit into reddened skin. She was an adult woman, likely in her early 30s, her dark hair matted with blood and snow, her face swollen and bruised beyond recognition in places. Her winter coat was torn open, the fabric soaked through, and her body shuddered with violent, involuntary tremors. She was alive. Barely. Each breath came shallow and uneven, a thin cloud of vapor escaping her lips. They were not arresting her. They were not waiting for transport. They were preparing to bury her. Cooper's rumble deepened his pause, digging slightly into the snow, as if the earth itself were holding him back. Daniel felt something cold and precise settle in his chest, a familiar sensation he had hoped never to feel again. Not fear, not panic, focus. The kind that stripped everything down to consequence and choice. 3 armed officers, 1 unarmed woman, 1 whole. Daniel's jaw tightened, teeth grinding softly as his hand clenched harder inside his pocket. He knew the rules. He knew what stepping into this would mean. If he intervened, he would not be a witness. He would be a suspect, a veteran with a record, a man already halfway outside the protection of polite society. If he walked away, the forest would swallow the sound of the last breath she took, and the snow would hide the rest by morning. Cooper trembled, not with fear, but with restrained violence, his loyalty pulling him forward even as training held him in place. Daniel glanced down at the dog, meeting his eyes. There was no confusion there, only readiness. This isn't our fight, Daniel thought, and immediately knew the lie for what it was. The wind gusted harder, blowing snow across the clearing. One of the men laughed a short, careless sound as a shovel struck stone. Another reached down and grabbed the woman by the arm, dragging her closer to the pit. She let out a weak, broken sound that barely cut through the storm. Daniel leaned closer to Cooper, his mouth near the dog's ear, his voice low and steady despite the storm raging inside his chest. "If I step out," he whispered, "no one walks away from this unchanged." Cooper's ears flicked back for a fraction of a second, then forward again, his body coiled, waiting. In the clearing, the shovel scraped again. The woman was pulled closer to the edge. Snow fell harder. Daniel took a breath slow and deep, the kind he had learned to take before breaching doors that might explode in his face. "If I step out," he murmured into the wind, "this night ends broken." The shovel struck earth. The woman screamed once. And Daniel shifted his weight forward just as the forest seemed to hold its breath. Snow swirled violently through the clearing, thick flakes driven low by a cutting wind, turning the night into a tunnel of white noise and broken visibility. Daniel Brooks moved first. The decision had already been made, somewhere deeper than thought, in the same place where instinct had once kept him alive. He stepped out from the trees and went downhill, fast boots sliding and catching on frozen roots as gravity pulled him forward. Beside him, Cooper launched in silence, a dark blur cutting through falling snow muscles, releasing all at once. The first deputy never saw the dog. Cooper hit him low and hard, 75 pounds of trained force, slamming into the man's chest and driving him backward into the snow. The German shepherd's jaws closed on the man's forearm with crushing precision. Not wild, not panicked exactly where he had been trained to strike. The deputy screamed the sound sharp and brief, his shovel clattering uselessly to the ground as Cooper dragged him down and pinned him. Daniel closed the distance on the second man before the deputy's hand reached his holster. Years of muscle memory took over. Daniel struck once a compact blow to the jaw that snapped the man's head sideways, followed immediately by a knee to the midsection that folded him over with a strangled gasp. The third deputy reacted a half-second too late, fumbling for his weapon, as Daniel pivoted, grabbed the front of the man's jacket, and drove him face first into the frozen ground. The impact knocked the air from his lungs. Daniel followed with a controlled strike to the side of the neck, enough to shut him down without killing him. The entire engagement lasted less than 8 seconds. The clearing fell eerily quiet, broken only by the wind and the panicked breathing of the deputy trapped beneath Cooper. Daniel scanned quickly, eyes, sharp body coiled, waiting for movement that didn't come. "Out," Daniel said softly. Cooper released instantly, stepping back with his teeth bared his chest, heaving amber eyes locked on the fallen man, as if daring him to try anything foolish. Daniel turned toward the woman. She lay where she had been dropped, curled slightly on her side, snow gathering in her hair and along the torn seams of her jacket. Up close, the damage was worse. Her face was bruised and swollen, one eye nearly closed, dried blood dark against pale skin. Her breathing was shallow and uneven, a soft rasp with every inhale. She was conscious, barely, her eyes fluttering open and shut, as if fighting to stay anchored to the world. "It's over," Daniel said quietly, as he knelt beside her, cutting the zip ties with the small knife he carried, clipped inside his jacket. His movements were efficient, but gentle, the way he had learned to work on wounded teammates when chaos still raged around them. "You're safe." The words felt fragile, almost dishonest, but they were the only ones he had. She winced as circulation returned to her hands, a weak sound escaping her lips. They'll come back," she whispered, voice hoarse and barely audible over the wind. "They won't," Daniel replied, though he knew better than to believe it. Not yet, anyway. He lifted her carefully, surprised by how light she was, and felt the tremors running through her body, violent and uncontrollable. Hypothermia. Likely broken ribs from the way she guarded her left side, breath hitching with pain. Daniel pulled her close, shielding her from the wind with his own body as he backed toward the tree line. "Cooper," he said, and the dog moved instantly, flanking them, checking the perimeter with quick, efficient sweeps of his head. They vanished into the forest as quietly as they had appeared, leaving behind 3 broken men, an unfinished grave, and no witnesses willing to explain what had happened. The cabin sat low and half buried in snow, its rough-hewn logs silvered with age barely visible, unless you knew exactly where to look. Daniel pushed the door open with his shoulder, the hinges protesting softly, and carried the woman inside. The interior smelled of old pine dust and cold iron. This place had once been home long before deployments and funerals and long nights that never quite ended. He laid her gently on the narrow bed against the wall and moved quickly, stripping off his gloves and jacket to wrap around her core, conserving heat. "Stay with me," he murmured, though her eyes had already closed. He built a fire with practiced efficiency, the flames catching and growing, throwing weak but welcome warmth into the room. Cooper stationed himself by the door, sitting tall and alert, his dark coat steaming slightly as snow melted off him. Despite the violence moments earlier, his posture was calm, controlled, as if this was simply another assignment to be completed. Daniel knelt beside the bed, checking her pulse, fast, thready, then her breathing. He pressed gently along her ribs, noting the sharp intake of breath that confirmed his suspicion. He had seen this before. Too many times. He reached for his pack, pulling out a basic field kit, cleaning a shallow cut along her temple and covering it with gauze. She stirred her brow, furrowing lips moving. "They didn't try to kill me because I talked," she whispered, words tumbling out in a fevered rush. "They wanted the proof." Daniel paused, his hands still. "What proof?" he asked, leaning closer. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment, dark and determined despite the pain. "They didn't try to kill me because I know," she said, voice cracking. "They tried because I'm carrying something that can end the whole town." Then her body went slack again, exhaustion dragging her back under. Daniel sat back on his heels, the weight of the night settling onto his shoulders. He looked at Cooper, who met his gaze steadily, as if acknowledging what they had both just crossed into. This was no longer a rescue. It was a line drawn in the snow, one that could not be erased by morning. Daniel knew one thing with absolute certainty, as the fire crackled softly behind him. Whatever she was carrying, whatever truth she held on to through pain and terror, it had already changed everything. Morning came slowly to the mountains, a pale gray light filtering through snow-heavy clouds, casting the forest in muted silence that felt less peaceful than watchful. Daniel Brooks sat on a wooden chair near the cold hearth, his elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the woman sleeping fitfully on the narrow bed. The fire had burned low, leaving only embers, and a faint warmth that barely pushed back the chill. Cooper lay stretched across the doorway, his large frame blocking it completely, ears twitching at every sound, outside amber eyes, half-lidded, but never truly resting. Laura Bennett woke with a sharp gasp, her body jerking as pain flared through her ribs. She was 32, with dark brown hair cut short for practicality rather than style. Her skin pale now beneath fading bruises that marked her face and neck. Even injured, there was a hardness in her eyes when they opened a focused intelligence sharpened by months of fear and long nights chasing leads that others were too afraid to follow. She took in the cabin quickly, the fire, Daniel's still figure, the German shepherd guarding the door. "You're still here," she said hoarsely. Daniel nodded. "You passed out." She tried to sit up, failed, and hissed softly through clenched teeth. Daniel moved instantly, steadying her with a firm but careful hand. He could feel the tremor beneath her skin, not just from cold, but from the weight of what she had carried alone for too long. "You said you were carrying proof," Daniel said, keeping his voice low, controlled. "Start from the beginning." Laura closed her eyes for a moment, gathering herself. When she spoke again, the words came measured, deliberate, as if she had rehearsed them 1,000 times in her head. "This town isn't what it pretends to be. I came here chasing overdoses that never made the news money that vanished through shell companies no one wanted to trace. Every trail led back to one name." She opened her eyes and met Daniel's. Mark Reynolds. Daniel felt a familiar tightening in his chest. He knew the name. Everyone within 50 miles did. Sheriff Mark Reynolds had been in office for nearly 20 years, a fixture of the town, re-elected without opposition, praised for keeping crime low and order high. Reynolds was a tall man in his late 50s with iron-gray hair kept meticulously short and a square jaw that cameras loved. He wore his uniform like a tailored suit, always pressed, always clean, projecting calm authority. In public he was genial, slow to anger a man who shook hands at church picnics and remembered names. In private, according to Laura, he was something else entirely. "He runs the drugs." Laura continued, her voice steady despite the pain. "Distribution, laundering, enforcement. He doesn't touch the product himself. He uses deputies, contractors, people who owe him money or favors. He makes it look like accidents, disappearances, overdoses, and anyone who talks." She swallowed hard. "They don't get arrested. They get erased." Daniel leaned back slightly, absorbing the scope of it. He had seen corruption before overseas, dressed in different uniforms but driven by the same hunger. What unsettled him was how familiar it sounded, how quietly efficient. "I recorded everything I could," Laura said. "Meetings, phone calls, payments. He got sloppy, too confident. I think he believed the badge made him untouchable." Daniel glanced at her boots drying near the fire, worn and unremarkable. "You hid it on you." Laura nodded once. "Inside the heel, a micro SD card. He figured it out eventually. That's why they tried to kill me." Outside, the distant hum of engines drifted faintly through the trees, then faded. Cooper's ears lifted, his body tensing subtly. Daniel stood and moved to the small window, peeling back the curtain just enough to look out. Nothing visible yet, but the forest no longer felt empty. "They'll come," Daniel said. "If they aren't already." Laura's mouth tightened. "He won't stop. Not now." Miles away in the center of town, Sheriff Mark Reynolds stood inside his office, hands resting calmly on the edge of his desk, as deputies moved around him with tense urgency. The room smelled of coffee and cold air radios crackling with overlapping voices. Reynolds' expression remained composed, his pale blue eyes sharp and calculating as he listened. "Repeat," he said evenly. "A local hunter reported gunshots in the forest," a deputy replied. "3 of ours are down, 1 injured badly." Reynolds' jaw flexed once. Only once. Inside, something colder than anger took hold. He had not risen this high by panicking. Problems were tools to be used, not emotions to be indulged. "Put out the alert," Reynolds said. "Full county." He turned toward the bulletin board, already visualizing the narrative. "Daniel Brooks, former Navy SEAL, history of combat trauma, armed and unstable." A younger deputy hesitated. "Sheriff Brooks has no priors. He lives quiet, keeps to himself." Reynolds' gaze snapped to him, calm but razor sharp. "He assaulted officers and abducted a woman. That makes him dangerous." He continued without raising his voice. "Laura Bennett is a kidnapping victim, disoriented, likely coerced. And the dog..." His lips curved faintly. "The dog attacked law enforcement." The room fell silent. No one argued. They never did. "Deploy the drones," Reynolds ordered. "Thermal sweep. I want the woods crawling. And set traps along the old logging routes. He knows the terrain. We'll use that." Back in the cabin, Daniel felt the shift before he heard it. The distant mechanical whine of a drone cut through the morning air, faint but unmistakable. Cooper rose to his feet, hackles lifting a low warning sound vibrating through his chest. "They're hunting us," Laura said quietly. Daniel nodded. He felt it too, the tightening net, the deliberate escalation. This was no search and rescue. It was containment, elimination. "They control the town," Laura added, her voice hard. "People won't help you. They're scared." Daniel looked at Cooper, then back at Laura. He had stepped into worse situations before, but rarely one where the enemy wore familiar faces and claimed lawful authority. "Then we don't rely on the town," Daniel said. "We rely on truth." Outside, the drone's hum grew louder, circling somewhere above the trees. The forest that had once offered silence now felt like a cage slowly closing in. Daniel reached for his jacket, pulling it on the old leather stiff in the cold, and tightened the gray scarf around his neck. This was no longer about one rescue. It was about surviving a manhunt designed to make them disappear, and somewhere in the snow-covered woods, Mark Reynolds was already confident that it would succeed. The temperature dropped sharply as dawn bled into a dull gray morning, the forest exhaling mist and cold that settled low to the ground like a living thing. Daniel Brooks felt it in his bones before he saw it in the sky. The sound came next, a distant mechanical whine, thin but unmistakable, cutting through the hush of snow and pine. He froze, one hand lifting instinctively, palm down, a silent command. Cooper halted immediately, muscles locked, breath steady. Laura Bennett stood a step behind them, her face pale, lips tinged blue from cold pain etched into every shallow breath she took. Drone, Daniel said quietly, eyes scanning the gaps between branches. The machine hovered somewhere above the tree line, invisible, but present, searching for heat. Daniel's mind raced with the cold clarity that had once made him lethal, and now made him dangerous to anyone standing too close. Running was useless. Hiding in plain sight would get them killed. He spotted the creek bed ahead, swollen with snowmelt and mud, its banks slick and dark. "Down," he said. There was no time for explanation. Daniel grabbed Laura under the arms and dragged her toward the bank, as Cooper followed without hesitation. The mud was icy thick, sucking at boots and hands as they slid into it. Daniel pressed Laura flat, coating her clothes and hair, with freezing sludge, his own breath fogging as he worked quickly, methodically smearing mud across exposed skin to mask heat. Cooper lowered himself beside them, allowing Daniel to pack mud along his flanks and chest, the dog enduring it without a sound, eyes fixed upward as the drone's hum grew louder. The cold was immediate and brutal. Laura bit down on a scream as the shock tore through her body, every nerve flaring. Daniel leaned close, his voice low and steady, anchoring her. "Don't move. Don't breathe fast." He draped his arm protectively across her shoulders, forcing his own breathing slow and shallow. The drone passed overhead, lingering its unseen eye searching for the warmth of living bodies. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Cooper remained perfectly still, a statue of mud and fur loyalty, overriding instinct. Finally, the sound drifted away, fading into the distance. Daniel waited another full minute before moving. When he finally pushed himself up, his muscles protested violently, joints stiff and aching. Laura shook uncontrollably, teeth chattering now that adrenaline had begun to ebb. Cooper rose and shook himself, once mud cracking and falling from his coat, then immediately returned to Daniel's side. They moved on slower now, the forest revealing new dangers with every step. Cooper stopped again, nose low, tail rigid. Daniel followed his gaze and saw the steel jaws half buried beneath leaves, a bear trap, freshly set teeth gleaming with oil. Beyond it, a thin wire glinted between trees attached to a shotgun rigged waist-high. These weren't tools for search and rescue. They were instruments of execution. "He's not trying to arrest us?" Laura whispered, horror cutting through her exhaustion. Daniel nodded grimly. "He's trying to erase us." The realization settled heavy in his chest. This was no longer law enforcement gone wrong. This was a man hunting human beings, as if they were animals, confident no one would stop him. Cooper led them carefully through the maze of death, his movements precise, despite the tremor beginning in his hind leg. The shot came without warning. A sharp crack split the air, and Cooper yelped a short, pained sound that tore through Daniel like a blade. The dog staggered, blood blooming dark against his tan fur near the shoulder. Daniel dropped instantly beside him, hands shaking despite his control. "I've got you," Daniel murmured, pressing his scarf against the wound to slow the bleeding. Cooper whined softly but did not pull away, his amber eyes locked on Daniel's face, trust unbroken. Laura watched, tears freezing on her lashes as Daniel bound the injury as best he could with what little he had. "We can't keep moving like this," she said, fear creeping into her voice. Daniel looked around, calculating. The forest felt tighter, now closer. Then he saw the faint curl of smoke rising through the trees. A cabin, not abandoned alive. They approached cautiously, Daniel supporting Cooper, Laura leaning heavily on his shoulder. The door opened before they could knock. Margaret Hill stood there, shotgun cradled loosely in her arms. She was 68 tall and lean despite her age, with iron-gray hair pulled back into a tight braid and skin weathered by years of mountain winters. Her eyes were sharp, assessing the eyes of someone who had seen too much to be easily fooled. She wore a thick wool sweater beneath a faded army jacket, movements economical, steady. "Daniel Brooks," she said, recognition flickering across her face. "I heard the drone. And the gunshot." Daniel met her gaze without flinching. "We need help." She stepped aside immediately. "Then get inside." Margaret moved with practiced efficiency, setting aside the shotgun and pulling medical supplies from a cabinet that spoke of long habit rather than hobby. She cleaned Cooper's wound with firm, gentle hands, Her mouth set in a thin line of concentration. "Missed the bone," she muttered. "Lucky dog." "He's more than lucky," Daniel said quietly. Margaret glanced at him, something like approval in her eyes. "I was a field nurse," she said. "Vietnam. I've patched up worse with less." As she worked, Laura told her what little she could. Margaret listened without interruption, jaw tightening at the mention of Mark Reynolds. "I know him," Margaret said finally. "I've known what he is for a long time. Most of us do. Fear keeps mouths shut." She finished bandaging Cooper and looked at Daniel squarely. "If you're still standing, it's time to end this." Daniel exhaled slowly. The plan formed with brutal clarity. "There's a county emergency broadcast tower north of here," he said. "If we can get Laura there, she can put the truth on every frequency. He can't stop that." Margaret nodded once. "He'll try." "I'll draw him off," Daniel continued. "Make noise. Give her time." Laura's eyes widened. "That's suicide." Daniel shook his head. "It's a distraction." Margaret looked between them, then down at Cooper, who had lifted his head, despite the pain tail thumping weakly against the floor. "The dog stays with Laura," Daniel said firmly. "He protects her." Cooper whined softly, but didn't argue, leaning into Daniel's leg as if memorizing him. Margaret set a pot of water on the stove, her hands steady. "Then you'd better be fast," she said. "Because once the truth goes out, there's no turning back." Daniel nodded, feeling the weight of the final move settle into place. This was no longer survival. This was strategy. And for the first time since stepping out of the trees, he felt something dangerous and rare hope. The night settled cold and clear over the valley, the snow easing into a brittle crust that reflected moonlight like shattered glass. Laura Bennett stood alone inside the county emergency broadcast tower, its concrete walls humming faintly with electricity, her breath fogging the air as she stared at the console in front of her. She was pale, wrapped in a borrowed jacket, ribs bound tight beneath her clothes. Pain a constant throb she had learned to ignore. Her dark hair was pulled back with shaking hands, her eyes sharp despite exhaustion. Fear had not left her, but it had changed shape. It no longer pressed her down, it pushed her forward. She inserted the micro SD card into the reader, the small click sounding far too loud in the empty room. For a moment she hesitated, thinking of the faces in town, the people who looked away, the people who whispered but never spoke. Then she pressed the transmit key. Across the valley, radios crackled to life. In kitchens and garages, in patrol cars and late-night diners, Mark Reynolds' voice filled the air, calm, authoritative, unmistakable, ordering men to take care of it, to make sure she doesn't talk, to finish the job quietly. The words echoed through the town like a confession carved in stone. People froze where they stood. A waitress dropped a mug. An old man turned up his radio with trembling hands. For the first time in years, the lie shattered all at once, too loud to ignore. Fear broke. Doors opened. Phones were raised. The silence that had protected Mark Reynolds for 2 decades collapsed in seconds. Miles away, Daniel Brooks stood at the edge of the old quarry, the wind cutting through his worn brown leather jacket, gray scarf pulled tight around his neck. He could see the lights of approaching vehicles cresting the road above engines, snarling as they boxed him in. The quarry was a bowl of stone and shadow, nowhere to run exactly where he had intended to be. His breath came steady despite the blood trickling down his temple, despite the weight of the rifle in his hands. Mark Reynolds stepped out of the lead vehicle, his tall frame rigid with fury. Under the floodlights, his once immaculate uniform was creased, his carefully controlled expression fractured. His gray hair was disheveled now, his pale eyes wild with disbelief. This was not how it was supposed to end. "You think this changes anything?" Reynolds shouted, raising his weapon. "You die here and I'll bury the rest." Daniel said nothing. He thought of Laura at the tower of Margaret Hill standing her ground, of the people finally listening. He had crossed too many lines to retreat now. Reynolds lifted his rifle finger, tightening. The world seemed to slow. Then Cooper moved. The German shepherd burst from behind a pile of rock, his injured shoulder stiff, his gait uneven but unstoppable. At 7 years old, battered and bleeding, Cooper still carried the power of everything he had been trained to be. He did not hesitate. He launched himself upward, jaws clamping onto Reynolds' hand, and the rifle grip with bone-crushing force. There was a scream, sharp and raw, as the weapon discharged harmlessly into the dirt. Reynolds went down hard, his wrist collapsing under the force, the gun skittering away. Cooper stood over him, snarling, blood dark against his fur, his body shaking with pain and resolve. He did not release until Daniel was there, a firm hand on his collar, voice low and steady. "Out," Daniel said. Cooper obeyed instantly, collapsing against Daniel's leg, his breathing ragged but alive. The sound came next, deep and thunderous, rolling over the quarry like judgment. Helicopter rotors. Floodlights cut through the darkness, brighter than the quarry lights, washing everything in harsh white. Ropes dropped. "Federal agents, drop your weapons." FBI agents swarmed the scene with precise efficiency. Men and women in dark jackets, faces set with professional calm. One agent, tall and broad-shouldered with close-cropped hair and a scar along his jaw, cuffed Reynolds without ceremony. Another knelt beside Cooper, assessing the wound with practiced hands. Reynolds said nothing as he was dragged away, his power stripped in silence, the town he had ruled now, hearing every word of his crimes. By dawn, it was over. The valley was filled with quiet, not born of fear, but of release. News vans lined the road. Agents moved through offices, seizing files, unplugging phones, pulling truth into the open. Daniel declined interviews. He gave his statement and nothing more. He watched as Laura was guided into an ambulance, her hand lifting briefly in acknowledgement, her face set not in triumph, but in resolve. Weeks later, winter still held the land, but the river ran dark and steady beneath its skin of ice. Daniel sat on a fallen log along the bank, his old leather jacket creaking softly as he leaned forward, hands clasped. The gray scarf hung loose around his neck now, the fight finally behind him. Laura sat beside him, her posture careful but relaxed, healing, written in the quiet strength of her movements. She did not speak. Neither did he. Words were unnecessary. At their feet, Cooper lay stretched out, head resting on Daniel's boot, his breathing slow and even. The scar on his shoulder was still raw, but his eyes were peaceful, content simply to be there. The river flowed on, indifferent and eternal. There had been no parade, no applause, only a choice made in the dark and the refusal to turn away. And for Daniel Brooks, that was enough. Sometimes the greatest miracles do not come as thunder or fire from the sky. They come quietly through a choice made in the dark, through courage that refuses to look away, through loyalty that stands firm when fear says run. In this story, evil believed it could hide forever, but God's light has a way of finding even the deepest graves. Through one man's conscience, one woman's truth, and one faithful dog's devotion, justice was allowed to breathe again. In our daily lives, we may never face a moment this dramatic, but we all face choices, whether to stay silent or to stand for what is right. Scripture reminds us that the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story of courage and redemption. May God bless you and your family, watch over you in your coming and going, and give you the strength to be a light for others.